In the drawer of an old oak dresser that my parents had hastily put up for sale right before my return, I found a copy of an insurance policy in my grandfather's name, issued 40 years ago in London. In the beneficiary field, the unmistakable handwriting of the late Arthur Grayson spelled out my name in a sweeping hand, and just below it was the round seal of one of the oldest trust funds in the United Kingdom, a trust my father and mother had no idea even existed. They believed that while I was lying in a coma after a severe accident on the outskirts of Manchester, they had managed to erase my presence from the family history entirely, selling off the ancestral home and cashing out every accessible account. How they could commit such a depravity, stripping their own daughter of her only chance at rehabilitation, and why their grand scheme collapsed because of a single yellowed document they dismissed as trash, I still recall with a shudder. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because this story began long before the wheels of an oncoming truck erased my ordinary life. Before that ill-fated autumn, our family, at least on the surface, seemed like a model of respectability in a quiet suburb of Cambridge, where every evening smelled of freshly cut grass and expensive bergamot tea. My father, Richard Grayson, worked as a senior consultant at an investment firm and always wore impeccably pressed suits, while my mother, Elizabeth, hosted charity evenings and took pride in her 19th-century porcelain collections. I ran a small but successful restoration workshop in the city center, bringing old books and manuscripts back to life, work that gave me not only a stable income but genuine joy. Each morning began with a familiar ritual. I brewed strong coffee in a copper sezv, a gift from my grandfather, inhaled the bitter aroma of the beans, and carefully turned the thick pages of ancient paper, savoring their rough texture. Grandfather Arthur was the only person in the family who truly understood my passion for history, and it was he who owned the large Victorian house with a garden where I spent my best childhood years. My parents always regarded that estate with a kind of hidden, predatory envy, often hinting that maintaining such a property was far too expensive for a single young woman. On that last peaceful evening, we gathered in the living room of my parents' house to celebrate the successful completion of another financial quarter for my father. My mother gently dabbed her lips with a lace napkin, exchanged a quick glance with my father, and then turned her cold gray eyes toward me. At that moment, Richard was pouring collectible whiskey into heavy crystal glasses, and I noticed his fingers pause for a second, the ice clinking softly against the glass. Elizabeth smiled sweetly, offering me a slice of apple pie, and asked whether I was finally planning to upgrade the security system in my grandfather's house, since the old locks had grown rusty. I brushed it off, assuring her that the massive oak doors would last another century, and paid no attention to how quickly my parents exchanged a look. My father took a deep sip, the muscle in his right cheek twitching almost imperceptibly, but he quickly restored his usual mask of a benevolent, caring family patriarch. The oddities began to accumulate about 2 weeks before the accident, creating a faint but sticky sense of impending unease. Several times, when I stopped by my parents' house unannounced, I found them in heated discussions over documents that my father would immediately hide in his leather briefcase as soon as he noticed me at the door. When I asked about it, they responded evasively, attributing everything to complex tax audits and new property disclosure regulations supposedly affecting the entire family. My mother became almost suffocatingly attentive, regularly texting me to ask about my health and weekend plans. One day, I overheard my father speaking on the phone in his office with the door tightly shut, his usually steady, confident voice breaking into a hoarse whisper as he mentioned something about an urgent property valuation. I dismissed it all as pre-holiday stress and work pressure, assuming Richard was simply dealing with temporary difficulties he was too embarrassed to share with his daughter. The real first warning came when I stopped by the bank to pay the rent for my workshop, and my personal account manager casually asked why I had requested a full statement of all my savings through a third-party legal firm. My ears rang so loudly that the employee's voice became a distant hum, and my fingers gripping my leather bag went ice-cold. I replied that there must have been a mistake. I had not signed any such requests, nor hired any lawyers to review my finances. Back home, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at my cooling tea, trying to steady the tremor in my knees and convincing myself it was just a technical error in the banking system. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange knot in my throat and a deep insomnia, as if my subconscious was already screaming about betrayal while my mind still clung to the illusion of safety. That was the moment, just a couple of days before the catastrophe, when I should have understood everything, pieced together their strange questions and sudden interest in my accounts, but fate had other plans. On a rainy November evening, returning from a trip to a country estate where I had been meeting another rare book collector, my car skidded on a slick turn, and a heavy truck slammed into the driver's side at full speed. The next 4 months were erased from my memory, dissolving into a dull, dark void filled only with the beeping of medical monitors and the smell of hospital antiseptic. I woke up in a private clinic on the outskirts of London, feeling an overwhelming weakness throughout my body and a metallic taste of adrenaline on my tongue. My mother was sitting beside my bed. When she saw my eyes open, she let out a sharp breath and tightly squeezed my hand, but her fingers felt ice-cold. She gently stroked my hair, assuring me that the worst was over, and that I only needed to focus on long recovery and rest. Yet something in her voice, usually so sharp and controlled, carried a forced, brittle note that immediately put me on edge. The discharge process dragged on for another 2 weeks, during which my parents visited me strictly in turns, bringing home-cooked food and endlessly talking about how deeply they had worried about my life. My father kept twisting his heavy gold ring on his finger, avoiding direct eye contact, and lamenting the enormous medical bills for my treatment that they had allegedly had to pay out of their own savings. When I finally managed to stand on my own feet, we didn't go back to my beloved Victorian house, but instead to a small rented apartment on the outskirts that my parents had leased for me under the pretext that it had no steep stairs and would be easier for me to move around in. That day I was too exhausted to argue and obediently accepted the bundle of keys, which felt surprisingly heavy and foreign to me. I closed the door behind them, sank onto the worn-out sofa, and drifted into a heavy, anxious sleep in which I kept seeing my grandfather's mansion with its boarded-up windows. 3 days later, when my strength and ability to think clearly returned, I decided to go to my house to pick up my favorite restoration tools and archival documents that had been troubling me. As I approached the familiar wrought iron gate, I felt a cold sweat run down my back despite the muggy midday heat, and my heart started pounding somewhere in my throat. In the driveway stood a large moving truck, and 2 unfamiliar men in work overalls were slowly carrying my grandfather's favorite leather armchair and an antique grandfather clock out of the house. My gaze fell on the massive oak door, where right above the old bronze knocker there was a bright red sign that read "Sold," along with the logo of a major real estate agency. My legs instantly turned to rubber. I grabbed the iron bars of the fence so I wouldn't collapse onto the asphalt, and bile rose to my throat, hot and bitter. I slowly walked up to one of the workers, feeling everything inside me go still, as if waiting for a final verdict, and in a hoarse, broken voice asked what was happening here and who had authorized the removal of the belongings. The man looked at me in surprise, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and pulled a tablet with invoices from his pocket. In it, clearly written in black and white, was the name of the new owner, a developer from the capital apparently. He muttered that all property rights had been legally transferred to the rightful heirs 2 months earlier, while the former owner had been in long-term medical care with no prospects of recovery. At that moment, the world around me shattered into pieces, and one thought hammered in my mind like a bell. My parents had taken advantage of my helplessness to seize something that had never belonged to them. I turned around and nearly ran to the car, realizing I needed direct answers, and I would only get them in my parents' house. Bursting into their luxurious living room without knocking, I found my father and mother studying catalogs of high-end real estate in Spain, champagne glasses sitting on the table. Seeing me, pale, trembling-lipped, with a wild look in my eyes, Richard slowly rose from his chair, clenched his jaw so tightly that a large vein stood out, and put on a mask of offended dignity. Elizabeth quickly covered the brochure with her hand. Panic flickered across her face, but she quickly regained control and, in a sugary tone, said they had only wanted to spare me unnecessary trouble. I stepped forward, slammed my hand on the polished table so hard the glasses rang, and demanded an immediate explanation for why they had sold my grandfather Arthur's estate, which he had left exclusively to me. For a second, I thought my father might repent, that this was some monstrous misunderstanding, but his next words completely destroyed that fragile hope. "We did what we had to do for the good of the entire family," my father said coldly and evenly, in a voice that left me completely numb inside. "You were in a coma, the doctors gave no guarantees, and maintaining that huge mausoleum required enormous money that you simply didn't have. We found a medical report about your condition, arranged temporary guardianship, and sold the house to cover your treatment costs and secure our shared future." We're family, dear. You must understand we only acted in your best interest. My mother added with poisonous sweetness, trying to come closer and wrap her arms around my shoulders. The house was falling apart anyway, and now we have funds to buy a beautiful seaside villa where you can recover in warmth and comfort. In my best interest? I shouted, choking on every word and feeling tears of rage blur my vision. You sold my life, my memories of my grandfather, while I couldn't even move a finger, and you call that care? You're just vultures who waited for me to die so you could take what isn't yours. Watch your tongue, Catherine, my father growled, stepping right up to me and looming over me with his massive frame. You only stayed alive thanks to our legal efficiency, and if you try to make a scene, you'll be left on the street with not a single cent. All the documents are signed, the deal is closed, and the law is entirely on our side. So go back to your apartment and don't you dare ruin our lives. I looked at them, hoping to see at least a trace of shame or remorse. But my mother only silently turned toward the window, nervously adjusting a strand of her perfectly styled hair, while my father continued to bore into me with his heavy, merciless gaze. In that terrifying silence, I heard everything I needed to know about their true feelings toward me, and I understood that all those affectionate words from my childhood had been nothing but a facade. I turned around, slammed the door loudly, and ran outside, feeling the cold autumn rain instantly soaking through my thin jacket. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an automatic notification from the bank informing me that my personal account had been frozen due to a change in access rights by a decision of my guardians. The coffee I had drunk that morning turned completely bitter, like ashes in my mouth, and I realized I had nothing left. No home, no job, no money, no people I had once considered my parents. The next 2 days turned into a continuous nightmare, filled with aimless trips around the city and attempts to find any possible lead to challenge this monstrous arrangement. I reached out to an acquaintance who was a lawyer, someone I had once worked with when setting up my workshop documents, but he only shook his head sympathetically after reviewing the copies of the medical records I provided. He explained that my father had acted through a shell agency that skillfully exploited loopholes in guardianship law, and proving malicious intent in court would be nearly impossible, especially given their financial resources. Returning to my temporary apartment, I sat on the floor among unpacked boxes, hugging my knees and staring blankly into space, feeling completely crushed and helpless. My entire world, built with such effort, had collapsed in the snap of a finger by those who were supposed to protect me from any hardship. It was precisely in that moment of absolute despair, as I was going through one of the few boxes I had managed to take from my workshop before it was shut down, that an old, worn book on bookbinding from the 19th century fell onto the floor. It had been a gift from Grandfather Arthur for my 18th birthday, something I had always kept as my most precious talisman and never allowed anyone else to touch. I picked it up, gently running my fingers over the worn leather cover that smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper, and noticed that the back end paper felt unusually thick. My hands began to tremble as I carefully pried up the edge of the yellowed paper with my fingernail and discovered a skillfully hidden compartment containing a folded sheet of paper with watermarks. My heart began pounding so hard it became difficult to breathe, and my vision blurred as I unfolded the document and saw, printed at the top in bold type, the name of an old London trust. At first glance, it appeared to be an innocent copy of an insurance policy and a special directive left by my grandfather, written shortly before his death during his final trip to the capital. Arthur Grayson, an exceptionally perceptive man, had been well aware of his son Richard's selfish nature and understood that he would do everything possible to disinherit me. The document clearly stated that the manor and all surrounding lands were insured for a colossal sum with an international company, and that I was the sole beneficiary in the event of any unlawful transactions or attempts to transfer ownership. Moreover, it included a clause stating that the property could not be sold or transferred to any third party without my personal notarized signature, made in the presence of an independent representative of the London Trust. Any transaction made in violation of this rule would automatically be declared void, and all proceeds would be immediately frozen and confiscated by the trust, followed by the payment of substantial compensation to me. I read these lines 3 times, feeling a strange, icy click inside me, as if all my tears had instantly dried and my trembling hands had steadied, replaced by an absolute, ringing determination. My gaze fell on the mirror in the hallway. Staring back at me was not a frightened, broken girl who had lost everything, but a focused, dangerous person ready to go all the way. This knowledge completely transformed the situation, turning me from a helpless victim into a hunter who finally had a lethal weapon in her hands. My parents, in their endless greed and haste, hadn't even bothered to check my grandfather's old books, dismissing them as useless junk, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. The developer's deal with my father was set to close this coming Friday, which meant I had only 4 days to set my plan in motion and completely destroy their triumph. First, I called Mark, my grandfather's old friend and a top-tier inheritance lawyer who had once handled our family's affairs, but cut ties with my father because of his questionable methods. After listening to my fragmented but fact-supported story, Mark fell silent for a moment. Only his heavy, measured breathing could be heard on the line. Then he let out a low laugh, and steel-like notes entered his voice, the sound of a man who had just scented a big, justified case. He told me to immediately make high-quality scans of the document, send them to his encrypted email, and under no circumstances let my parents suspect that I had found anything. Mark promised to personally contact the leadership of the London Trust and prepare an official inquiry that would come as a complete shock to Richard and Elizabeth on the day of the final signing. All night before the decisive confrontation, I couldn't sleep, pacing the cramped rental apartment and endlessly drinking cup after cup of strong black coffee with no sugar. Outside, dim streetlights flickered, their harsh glow slicing through the darkness of the living room and reflecting off my phone screen, where my father's addresses and meeting schedule were open. I mentally rehearsed every future conversation, every possible reaction from my parents, preparing myself for the fact that they would use their entire arsenal, from fake tears to direct threats and pressure. My inner monologue was no longer filled with self-pity. I felt only the cold, calculated rage of someone whose dignity and the memory of their only loved one had been stolen. When the blinding morning sun touched the rooftops of neighboring houses, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusted my formal business suit, and realized I was fully ready for this battle. The final meeting was scheduled for Friday morning in a luxurious, sunlit conference room at the Central Bank branch, where my father planned to sign the last agreements with representatives of the construction company and transfer the money to his new offshore account. When I calmly walked into the room uninvited, several people were already seated there. An important representative of the developer in an expensive gray suit, a notary, the bank's personal manager, and my parents, who were sipping coffee and smiling victoriously. Seeing me, my mother went pale, her cup clinking softly against the saucer, while my father immediately stood up, folding his arms and flashing with rising anger. The developer's representative raised his eyebrows in surprise, shifting his gaze from me to Richard, and a tense, ringing silence filled the room, the kind in which carefully laid plans collapse. "Catherine, what the hell are you doing here?" My father hissed through his teeth, stepping toward me and trying to grab my arm to throw me out. "We have an important business meeting here, and your presence is completely inappropriate. Leave this room immediately, or I will call security and have you thrown out myself." "You're the one who's going to need security, Richard," I replied in a perfectly calm, icy voice that made him freeze for a moment. "All those adult matters you loved talking about are over. The real ones have begun. And this deal is not happening today, or ever again." "What nonsense are you talking about?" the mother exclaimed triumphantly, jumping up from her chair and nervously twisting her expensive wedding ring. "All the documents have been reviewed by lawyers. We are the legal guardians and have full authority to dispose of the property. Your opinion here is of no interest to anyone, so stop staging this pathetic circus in front of respectable people. The thing is, gentlemen," I addressed the developer's representative and the notary directly, completely ignoring my mother's shouting, "my esteemed parents have deliberately concealed from you the existence of a general trust agreement established by my grandfather, Arthur Grayson. According to this document, any attempt to sell the estate without my personal signature constitutes a criminal offense, and all your invested funds will be immediately frozen by an international court." At that moment, the conference room door opened again, and Mark entered the room holding a massive leather folder embossed in gold with the London Trust seal, accompanied by 2 stern men in dark suits who turned out to be official court bailiffs. The developer's representative, noticing the trust emblem, immediately changed in expression, set aside his expensive pen, and nodded to his lawyers, signaling that the proceedings were to be halted. Mark silently approached the table, placed the original copies of the grandfather's will and the official order freezing any registration actions regarding the Grayson property in front of the notary with a light thud. Watching this, my father began to slowly sink into his chair, his face turning an ashen color, cold beads of sweat appearing on his forehead, shattering his carefully crafted image of a successful businessman. "This is a forgery. She's lying about everything." Elizabeth screamed hysterically, addressing the bank representatives, but her voice trembled, revealing genuine animal fear. "Richard, do something. Why are they believing this girl? We calculated everything. She couldn't possibly have any documents." "The documents are authentic, Mrs. Grayson," Mark said, opening the folder and showing everyone the round official seals and signatures of London auditors. "Moreover, we have already filed a formal lawsuit for abuse of guardian authority and large-scale fraud. All accounts belonging to your husband, including those you tried to use to transfer the house deposit, have been frozen as of this morning by order of the Supreme Court." My father tried to say something, but only a hoarse, incoherent sound escaped his throat. He clenched his fists under the table so hard that his nails dug into his palms, but it could no longer change anything. The developer's representative slowly stood up, looked at Richard with disgust, gathered his papers, and curtly stated that their legal department was immediately initiating penalty enforcement and contract termination due to the concealment of critical encumbrances. The notary also silently nodded, gathered his seals, and quickly left the room, leaving my parents alone with the bailiffs and the collapse of their entire world. My mother sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands and crying softly, but those tears no longer evoked anything in me except cold contempt. I took a step forward, leaned toward my father, who sat completely motionless, staring at the polished surface of the table, and spoke the final words that would forever put an end to our relationship. "This apartment you rented for me was purchased with my future compensation, and your supposed triumph has been completely annulled. You are broke, Richard. Your accounts are now at absolute zero, and ahead of you lies a long court process that you will inevitably lose. I cut you off from my life the moment I opened my eyes in the hospital, and now the law will cut you off from freedom." After these words, an oppressive silence fell over the room, broken only by my mother's sobs and the dry rustling of papers as the bailiffs served documents to my father for signature. Mark and I turned and walked slowly toward the exit, and each step across the bank's marble floor echoed in my soul with an incredible, intoxicating lightness. The punishment my parents received mirrored their own crime. They had tried to leave me penniless and homeless while I was defenseless, and in the end they themselves lost all their savings, reputation, and social standing, now facing the threat of real imprisonment. The construction company issued such a massive penalty for breach of contract and lost profits that my father had to urgently put their own luxurious suburban house up for sale just to avoid immediate arrest. 8 months passed, and spring in Cambridge bloomed again, filling the air with the scent of fresh greenery, blossoming apple trees, and crisp river air. I sat on the veranda of my fully restored Victorian home, carefully holding a cup of hot Earl Grey tea, watching workers gently restore the old wrought iron garden fence. My workshop had reopened, and I now had even more orders than before, while the legal proceedings with my parents had finally concluded in my full victory and a massive compensation payout from the insurance company. Occasionally, I received letters from my father's lawyers with pitiful requests to soften the repayment terms, but I left them unanswered, understanding that everyone must bear responsibility for their choices. Richard now worked as a low-level clerk in a small office in the far north of the country, and Elizabeth had been forced to sell all her porcelain sets just to cover part of the debts. I took a deep breath, feeling the morning sun warm my face, and realized that the old heaviness had finally left my chest, replaced by absolute peace. The faded insurance policy paper that had saved me from poverty and oblivion now hung framed on the wall of my study, reminding me that justice always finds its way if you fight for it. The silence in my grandfather's house no longer felt frightening or lonely. It had become my personal fortress, filled with the scent of old books and a new, completely free life. My father had called me late last night from an unknown number. His voice was quiet, trembling, and broken, trying to mumble something about forgiveness and family ties, but I simply pressed the end call button. The copy of my grandfather's document on the entryway table faintly glimmered in the fading sunlight, confirming my complete and irreversible freedom from their toxic past.